Hello and welcome to another day for the Homeopathy Challenge. And today we're going to talk about why we use the medicines that we do in homeopathy. And it's going to be important to look at a little bit of the history of homeopathy and its development. As you know, Samuel Hahnemann was a medical doctor in Saxony, currently Germany, and he gave up his medical practice and went into translating medical texts to basically pay the bills. And he was curious about why a medicine named Cinchona bark, which is known as China officinalis in homeopathy, treated malaria. Cinchona bark is high in the substance quinine, and we still use quinine today, quinine sulfate actually, and it's a drug named Qualaquin. And we use it to treat malaria and other malaria-type symptoms. We used it in COVID. Hydroxychloroquine was, I think, the name of it. Hydroxychloroquine. And what's interesting about Qualaquin is that its listed side effects are somewhat similar to those of the medicine of Hahnemann's time, Cinchona bark. So on the warning label of quinine sulfate, or Qualaquin, which is not the generic brand, that's the drug brand. Quinine sulfate is the generic. It produces effects on your heart, kidneys, and blood cells. It has the warning to stop if you have headache with chest pain, dizziness, pounding heartbeat, bruising and bleeding, nosebleeds, purple or red spots under your skin, sign of infection such as fever, chills, and mouth sores, severe low back pain, obviously affecting your kidneys, or blood in your urine. So those are the common side effects people would experience from quinine. And not so dissimilar are those of the side effects of Cinchona bark. So this is a picture of it, and Hahnemann made a tincture, or took a tincture, of Cinchona and observed in himself the symptoms that it brought on. And those symptoms were similar to those of malaria. And you can see them here. There's a few. I'll just list them off. The weakness, the hemorrhaging, diarrhea, sweats, tinnitus, ringing in the ears, fainting, loss of sight, digestive complaints, colic at certain hour each day, worse after eating, better for bending double, neuralgias, swellings, palpitation, intermittent fever, alternating days of fever, and so on. Very, very precise. All about his flatulence, and belching doesn't relieve, nor does passing a stool. Headache, as if the skull would burst. And then flushing, and so on. So a lot of side effects, but what was more important, that those side effects of Cinchona were similar to those of malaria. And I made a note here that, obviously both Qualaquin, the drug of quinine, and Cinchona bark contain quinine as a principle. The side effects are somewhat different, but there are some characteristics, as you may have observed. And but basically the most important point here is that this enabled Hahnemann to come up with the concept that the reason Cinchona bark was effective in treating malaria was that it could produce similar symptoms to those of malaria. And if he, a healthy person, would take the Cinchona bark, it would produce the same symptoms as those of a sick person. That is why it cures the sick person. So this discovery led to the first law of homeopathy, the law of similis, which we define as like cures like. So furthering his experimentation on Cinchona and other drugs in use at the time, Hahnemann published his first treatise on the concept of similes in 1796. He published an essay on his new principle for ascertaining the curative power of drugs, naming this concept Prüfung in German, and that means proving in English. Hahnemann employed provings to gather the essential data on the effects of commonly used drugs of the time using healthy individuals. He administered doses of the drugs, often highly diluted, to colleagues, students, family, friends, and himself, all of whom were defined as being symptom-free and who adhered to specific guidelines, such as avoiding, even herbs in salads and teas. Participants meticulously documented any physical, mental, or emotional effects, which were then verified by investigating and exploring what were the exact symptoms that the person would feel. Unmedicated doses, which were placebo to make the experiments double-blind, were used as controls to further refine the results. So this meticulous process enabled Hahnemann to complete a pure materia medica of each drug being proved, and he worked on 67 remedies over 2 decades. So this was no small feat, because that's a lot of work. And I'd like to point out that there are more than 3,600 homeopathic medicines in use today, or written about, or searchable in the software that we use. And I would say that's actually too many, way too many. In summary, this proving data that Hahnemann and his followers collated from their experimentation on medicines remains in use today, and this data is still of the highest quality. So here's an example of how those symptoms were written out. And this is for the remedy Staphylococcus aureus. I thought I'd use that because of the other case we did in yesterday's follow-up, or the day before. Here we have the picture of it. It's the delphinium, and this is the ungenetically modified form, the wild, natural delphinium Staphylococcus aureus. I've actually forgotten the... delphinium is the common name. So these are some of the symptoms that it would produce, and they started from the head and worked downward. So vertigo, like stupefaction, but not in the open air. On stooping, on turning the head, so very detailed. Vertigo when walking. He ran up against the door with the dizziness. Vertigo when lying in bed in the evening, as if all turned round with him. Whirling vertigo, and on and on. So a confusion in the head, whirling in the forehead, confusion of the head. So many, many repeated nuances of similar symptoms. It goes on and on. I've only put a few things in here. Some of them I thought would be useful. Some of the pain symptoms in the head. Tingling and shooting in the whole head. Worse when stooping forwards. So this is just basically a very crude list. When bold type is used, it means many of the provers had this symptom in common. So some of these symptoms would be rare, and only 1 or 2 of the provers would have it, and in others, many, many of them would have these symptoms. So it would go on and on and on, an exhaustive list. And in fact, this list is very hard to use in practice because it's so jumbled together, basically. But we've found ways to work with this sort of information. But for our lesson today, what's important is that it's not a list of diseases that the remedies treat, but an actual list of symptoms that are produced by the remedies. So a homeopath discerns the alterations in the patient's health through their symptoms, and then matches these to a remedy that also produces these symptoms. So in the previous lesson, we learned about what makes up the symptom information that yields a reliable prescription, that of locations, conditions and sensations, modalities and concomitants. So you can see how the nuances of the homeopathic symptoms produced in the experiments of any medicine would suit a precise gathering of all the details of a patient's own symptoms, because we want those nuances in order to get the most precise match. If we get good information about their symptoms, we can match these to those produced in the proving experiments. So as the detail is exhaustive, we now use specialized books and, of course, computers to aid the process. So that we'll talk about tomorrow. So I hope that helped illustrate really where the information comes from. And where I didn't add a chapter on is the clinical use of the medicines, because that also adds to the data on the remedies. So thank you very much, and see you tomorrow for our final day.